right, well, welcome back. Hate to interrupt people's break, and I know a lot of great conversations happening around. I know it's a little later in the afternoon for those of us still on East Coast time. It's a lot later in the afternoon for those of you live streaming from the East Coast. Feel free to make this a happy hour. I normally like to start with a joke, but I left that on East Coast time, so we'll just jump right into it. And it seems so appropriate to follow the security and technology panel by talking about a conversation about grants and funding and elections. Of course, we can have great technology, we can have so many of these processes and procedures, but it takes investment. HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act, marked the first time we'd seen a federal investment in election administration, and that funding helped to modernize elections and led to the adoption of new voting technologies across the country. This also led to numerous innovations in how we conduct elections and the options available for voters to engage in the process. HAVA required the development of statewide voter registration databases, and with states like Arizona and Washington leading the way, now much of the country uses online voter registration. Similarly, at the beginnings of Colorado's efforts to pioneer risk-limiting audits, there are HAVA dollars helping to support that program. As was mentioned in the last panel, we now see a number of states adopting risk-limiting audits and pilot programs popping up around the country. These examples and many more highlight the potential impact of federal funding. That was one of the many reasons it was great to see Congress appropriating election security funds again in 2018 for the first time in several years. Congress responded to the foreign interference in 2016 by appropriating $880 million in grant funding for state and local election offices to improve election security. That was $380 million appropriated in 2018, $425 million in 2020, and $75 million earlier this year. Congress used that money to supplement state and local funding for election security, and what we saw was that this money across the country was utilized in different ways. With each state running elections in its own unique way, they had different needs, and so we saw some states replacing paperless voting equipment, others replacing statewide voter registration databases or hardening those systems. We saw countless hours of training across the country and innovations like cyber navigators, where you have state-based cyber professionals that are able to help regionally. As was talked about earlier, with some of the smaller jurisdictions, many of them don't have the resources or need for a full-time cyber professional. And so places like Illinois pioneered cyber navigator programs to address that need. Congress also provided $400 million of critical funding during the 2020 primary election season as the COVID pandemic threatened the basic functions of our democratic system. And while this support has had a significant impact on the security of elections, we do consistently hear about the need for regular, sustained funding that would assist in long-term planning. The nature of the threats that the elections community is facing are those that demand long-term investment in the infrastructure of our democracy. And while this panel is primarily focused on election funding and the need to invest in the system to ensure its lasting success, we must never forget the most important element of our democracy, and that is its people. The women and men across this country that serve as local election administrators have done heroic work in recent years. They put their own personal health and safety on the line to administer the election during 2020. They repeatedly rise to the occasion and meet challenge after challenge. They consistently do more with less and remarkably continue to get the job done. It's an honor and a privilege to call these people my colleagues and so many my friends. That said, election officials cannot do it alone and should not be expected to do so. As has been talked about before, this really has to be a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach to looking at the health of our democracy and investing in it in the way that it deserves to be. And it's not just about grants. That is certainly a big piece, but there are other ways to support election officials. As we heard about earlier, Since the designation of elections as critical infrastructure, our federal partners at CISA have helped provide expertise and access to resources to help defend against cyber and physical intrusions to election networks and offices. Additionally, I'm so proud of the EAC's increased build-out of our clearinghouse function to provide additional best practice resources for our state and local officials. The addition of a team of former election officials and subject matter experts able to create products that are responsive to the needs of election officials around the country is needed now more than ever. This team and the resources they produce are a direct result of the recent increases in the EAC's funding. But so much more can and must be done to support the increasing challenge our democracy faces. While we have returned from a low in 2019 of a $7.95 million operating budget, we are only now, even with the increases we've seen, the EAC is at a level that we were at in 2010 when you adjust for inflation. That was before the foreign interference of 2016, before the big lie and the fallout of the mis and disinformation that we've seen following the 2020 election. And when I travel across the country and talk with election officials, I see a community that needs support, needs help, and needs resources. And in order to do that, we have got to be adequately funded. And so as we have this conversation, 68 days before the 2022 midterm election, I believe the job of administering our elections has never been harder and has never been more expensive. And so on that note, we've got a lot to talk about, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel. As we begin with opening remarks from our panelists, I'd like to introduce our event's host state, Susan Lapsley, the California Deputy Secretary of State and HAVA Director and Counsel. Ms. Lapsley, I'll turn it over to you for opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I'd like to also thank the Pepperdine Public Policy School and specifically Dean Peterson. I think we've lost him. I can't see with the bright lights, but thank you for being such a great host. And then also to the EAC and the EAC commissioners. Thank you for all the work that you guys do. You really do a lot of work that people don't see and don't understand. Coming from a state that has a lot of interaction with all of you, appreciate it, and really applaud the work that you do. I was sitting in the very back, and I couldn't see when there was an introduction by Chairman Hicks of the students, so I couldn't see hands. I'm going to lean on you, students. Can you stand up, please? Come on. Come on, stand up. You're not the only one. There's other students. Are you the only one left? Oh. Well, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. So, have you ever seen a butterfly ballot?
This is going to be really crushing, but I'm an Australian student, so...
You have?
A boomerang ballot.
I don't know the name.
A butterfly ballot is like a butterfly. It's open like this, and it has it's separated, so it's like literally like a butterfly. 2 pages.
Above the line and below the line.
Yes. Okay. You've seen one in real life?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. How about a punch card ballot? Okay. So, well, back in 2000, we were all riveted on the edge of our seats watching television because the internet was there, but it wasn't. You didn't have TikTok showing you everything and YouTube showing you everything. We were riveted learning about butterfly ballots and punch card ballots and hanging chads, and it was a real learning experience for everyone, for the nation as a whole, because people didn't really pay attention to elections or election administration, and that's what that election did. It focused attention, laser focused on it, and it got us arguing and talking around the dinner table about hanging chads and what local registrar did this and did that, and really engaged and identified issues around election administration. And so when I was asked to be on this panel, I got to thinking way back then about that experience, and I think many of the panelists have said that election administration finds you, you don't choose it. I did not choose it either. I was a law clerk to a federal judge, and I was finishing up my law clerk, my clerkship, and I was asked by the then Nevada Secretary of State to come and be his elections director. I had just gone through watching that. I was thinking, wow, that looks really exciting, looks really controversial. I don't know. I did it, and it was the best decision of my life because election administration chooses you, and once you're in it, either you love it or you hate it. Many of those that work with me, we have that conversation of either you love it and you stay in it, or you're like, this is too much for me, I'm out, and you don't do it anymore. But that's what 2000 did, and it crystallized a lot of the issues, and HAVA intended to solve those issues. And those issues at the time were trust and confidence in the elections process, modernization of our election process, accessibility to our election process, and funding. So here we are 22 years later after HAVA, the passage of HAVA, and as I thought about this panel, before we really decided it was going to be really about funding, thought about those issues and what HAVA was intended to do. It did solve a lot of those issues, but we've come full circle, or maybe those issues are never going to leave us as election administrators. They will be ongoing, because as we sit here 20 years later, and really 22 years later since the 2000 election, we still have, as an issue, trust and confidence in our system. And you guys heard about that during the first panel, and now it's around mis and dis and malinformation. There's also modernization is still an issue. Back then it was about having a new voting system, replacing punch cards, replacing the butterfly ballot, and also voter registration, having state-run voter registration systems, having a clear and consistent data across a state and potentially, across the United States. So that was then. Nowadays, we still have modernization as an issue. So a lot of the voting technology that was bought back in after the passage of HAVA, and that has created issues for other jurisdictions, not California. California is an exception to this, and we can talk more about California, but as a nation, we are finding that states don't have the money to replace those systems. And so here we are 20 years later, and systems, you can't find parts for them. They're no longer, there's platforms that aren't serviceable anymore. There's issues with the technology, and states need to replace the technology. Voter registration system. So HAVA mandated statewide voter registration system. So states went ahead and they either built it or modified their systems. California has the distinction of being the last in the country to have a HAVA-compliant statewide voter registration system. It's not a badge. It's a badge, actually. It was a process getting there, but our system is modern and current and very new, and I like to joke it's kind of a preteen right now as far as a system goes. But other states, they have systems that are 10, 15 years old that need to have voter registration 2.0. So there needs to be the funding, and we'll get to that, that's the next issue, funding of it to replace those systems or to upgrade those systems to make sure that they can meet the needs of today. And hand in hand with modernization, I think, is security. We've talked a lot about security in the last panel. It was great to have that conversation. Security was an issue back in 2000, but it's also an issue now, 20 years later, 22 years later, that we still talk about because the technology has changed. Security needs have changed. The designation as critical infrastructure has changed the dialogue, but it's still an issue that we face in election administration. And accessibility. Tracy, I think, talked quite a bit about accessibility. Accessibility back during the passage of HAVA was about accessibility. You go to the polling place, you show up, the machine should be on, it should be accessible for you to use, and the poll worker should know how to use it. Accessibility now is still an issue, but it's a different conversation. It's about the other technologies. It's about getting into the polling place and making sure that if I have mobility issues, that I can actually get into the location to use that system that is accessible to me. And emerging issues, I think Deke will talk about this, not to steal your thunder, but I'll probably talk about this in the next panel, about vote by mail accessibility. So if I'm a blind voter, having a vote by mail ballot, it's not accessible to me if I have to mark it with a pen and paper. So technology and accessibility have changed and the dialogue has changed as we go into it. And the final thing is funding. So back then it was, oh, we have all these changes. So, who's going to pay for this? You want a statewide voter registration database. Who's going to pay for it? You're going to get rid of punch cards. Who's going to pay for it? Which is a great conversation. You need to have that. But elections need to be funded ongoing in a consistent amount by the state, local, and federal government. You have to have a whole of government approach. Everyone needs to be committed to it, and it can't be once every 20 years. You can't wait until your voting systems are using duct tape and Band-Aids to keep it together, right? You can't wait until your voter registration system is on its last leg and the servers no longer are operable and secure, and you have to have ongoing funding at a rate that is sufficient to actually get it done. You can't just have little bits here, little bits there. It's got to be ongoing and consistent to make sure that it really is impactful, and that we as election administrators and those that are care about our democracy have comfort and knowledge that it will be done the right way. So thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to continue in alphabetical order, so we'll skip over, and I will... Got to recognize our state partners first. So I'd also like to welcome Joel Watson from the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. Mr. Watson serves as the Deputy Secretary of State for Outreach Services. Mr. Watson, I'll turn it over to you for opening comments.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. Secretary Ardwin regrets that he had to miss this event in person, and after I show him the pictures I've taken and describe the weather to him, I'm sure he'll be especially remorseful. The Help America Vote Act's funding mechanism has helped Louisiana during three critical moments in the past 20 years. The replacement of lever voting machines in the earliest days of HAVA, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic mixed with our post-hurricane recovery, and our current move to a new paper-based voting system. To start, in the fall of 2006, Louisiana fully implemented the voting system we currently employ, finally moving away from the lever voting machines to direct record electronic machines. This process began in 1990 with 12 parishes over the next 15 years using these DREs, and in 2005, using HAVA dollars, the process to procure this system for the remaining 52 parishes began. In 2020, Louisiana was one of the hardest hit states during COVID-19, and the issues that stemmed from it, such as the ongoing supply chain crisis, were exacerbated further by Hurricanes Laura, Delta, and Zeta, the last of which hit just 6 days prior to the presidential election. Securing masks, hand sanitizer, plexiglass dividers, and other personal protective equipment was hard enough when 93% of our state's electorate chose to vote in person, but add to that our need to purchase things like tents for places where buildings had been destroyed or were not suitable for voting, and the post-COVID CARES Act funding via HAVA was a huge help. The $6.2 million we received in emergency HAVA funds through the CARES Act in 2020 mainly went toward hazard pay for election commissioners, which helped ensure that we were not severely short-staffed, especially in the hardest hit areas of our state. And it also helped with the acquisition of an emergency voting solution known as a BizBox, which is a temporary movable voting site that takes sanitary precautions into account while also being useful in the aftermath of storms where there is no polling site available. Additionally, Louisiana is in the midst of securing a new voting system because we are one of, if not the last state, to still use DREs statewide. However, the process to transition to a paper-based voting system is underway, and Louisiana has nearly $14 million in HAVA grant dollars in a fund that will go towards the purchase of new equipment. Along with investments by our state legislature, we have $30 million dedicated towards that effort. Now, with that said, HAVA is not perfect. Secretary Ardwan believes one of the greatest challenges we face with HAVA going forward from an election administration standpoint is the desire by some in Washington to use HAVA's funding mechanism to force states to alter their election policies and procedures. We saw this during the earliest days of COVID in 2020. Changing our election laws for more federal money is not a trade-off we are willing to accept in Louisiana, and one that we hope politicians in Washington do not resort to as a means to an end. Thanks again for having me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. And our final panelist for this discussion is Matthew Wilde, the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Matthew, I'll let you give a few brief remarks.
Great. Well, thank you, Commissioner Hovland, and thank you to the EAC and to Pepperdine for inviting me to be here today. When I'm on a panel and I'm introduced as the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, I think it's always best to start with what the Bipartisan Policy Center is, because it seems like an oxymoron, DC-based group that's focused on bipartisanship. So BPC is a DC-based think tank that actively fosters bipartisanship by combining the best ideas from both parties that promote the health, security, and opportunity for all Americans. BPC has been around for about 15 years. We focus on many federal policy issues, but for the past 10 years, we have branched out to focus on I think the most important issue, which is mostly a state level issue, which is elections. And I've been leading that work for the past 10 years. I should note we were founded by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Senators Daschle, Dole, Mitchell, and Baker. And we do come at every issue, not with the solution in mind, but making sure we have organic bipartisanship in the groups that we assemble to think about policy issues. When Commissioner Hovland asked me to be on this panel, I could talk about anything for a really long time, and Ben knows that, but I wanted to put at least 3 items on the table first, and happy to expand upon any of them or anything else that comes up during the Q&A. I should also note, I think we now have 2 students in the room, and so for you 2 of you, BPC also has internships. They are paid internships, and we have them in the fall, spring, and summer. For all of the Pepperdine students that are watching on the webcast, contact me. All right, so what are the 3 issues that I think are most important today to discuss? One, it's been brought up in many ways throughout the day, but I think it's important to put a finer point on it, is the irregularity and the unpredictability of federal funding. So I'll talk about that first. The second one is, what are the outside-the-box ways of fixing that problem? Because the way the federal budgeting, federal appropriation process works, it's hard to commit federal funding for long periods of time. And the third one that I want to talk about is the trend away from outside funding and what that might mean for states and some of the unpredictable or the unexpected consequences of moving away from outside funding. So on the first one, on the irregularity of federal funding, in my perspective, and the perspective of BPC, that leads to money being spent somewhat ineffectively and certainly inefficiently. So I certainly agree that the states have primary responsibility for elections, and certainly elections have become a lot more complex. I think what we've seen over the past 5 years, though, is also much more interest in not just elections and the kind of the political horse race, but many more Americans actually have a perspective and an opinion about how Americans vote, about the entire process itself. And certainly when one, even small jurisdiction has an issue, that can become a national scandal that undermines confidence in elections everywhere. And it's very clear that the level of funding that has been made available at the local level has not expanded relative to the increased complexity. A lot of the problems that do happen, not everyone, but some of these problems could have been prevented if election officials had more resources. So it's been noted throughout the day that $5 billion has been appropriated for elections since HAVA passed, which is great. It's a big number, although we have to remember that the vast majority of that, almost $3 billion, $3.5 billion, came in the first couple of years after HAVA was passed, and that there were no funds appropriated between 2010 and 2018. So we've had large gaps. What we've had in 2018, 2020, and 2022 are these so-called airdrops of money, when election officials in the states and the counties can't necessarily expect it. It may seem to kind of the outside observer that funding coming in 18, 20, and 22 is somewhat regular. I posit that that's more of a coincidence than any kind of plan Congress had. Actually, I'd say Congress had no plan at all when they did this. And most election officials had no idea the money was coming until they read the bill that came out in the middle of the night. So they couldn't plan for it at all. The fact that it's also come in federal election years, I would argue, is a negative for federal funding. And we could talk about why that might be. or the maintenance of more federal funding coming down the pike. The reason I say that is because, as we heard, when federal funding is appropriated, there are typically strings attached. A lot of the funding that has been appropriated over the past couple of years didn't really have very many policy strings, but there's still expectations when you talk to members and staff on the Hill. They expect that the money is going to be spent very quickly and actually mitigate any challenges that election officials might be having for the upcoming federal elections. For many reasons, money that's appropriated in a federal election year isn't going to have much of an impact on that upcoming federal election. But because of the expectations that members of Congress and their staff might have about federal funding, it ends up being a feedback loop of evidence why federal funding isn't very effective, because it's not fixing the problems right away, and that's never how federal funding is going to work. So BPC put out a report in May, and I should have updated the numbers I'm about to tell you, so don't take them as the most updated, about some of the election security grants that were appropriated in 2018 and 2020. 84% of the 2018 funds have been spent, and 23% of the 2020 funds have been spent. So there's still a lot to go. So I guess the question is, why has it been so slow? I would argue that in a weird way, the lack of regularity of funding actually encourages states and counties to spend more slowly, because they don't know when the next tranche of money is coming. I'd also argue that it's pretty inefficient. If you talk to election officials on the ground, most of what they need is more staff, more experts, cybersecurity, but just for every part of the election process that is much more complex. But most government at every level cannot hire if they can't find longer-term reliable funding to maintain that new hire. States also submit to the EAC detailed plans for how they're going to spend that money when those dollars are to come to the states. And if you read those proposals, which I've done, but also Grace, who's on my staff, has read all of them, you'll see that states have big plans for what they're going to do with this funding. It's to completely change their voter registration systems, or to buy new systems for the entire state. As much funding as has happened in the past 4 years, we've heard that's $1.3 billion. It's a big country, and that doesn't go as far as people might realize. In 2022, California is getting about $5 million of the $75 million. California is a pretty big state. That's not going to have a huge impact if California wanted to spend money to replace all the voting systems. And so the states and the localities are incentivized to hold on to that money, to build up some reserves over time so they can buy those big capital expenditures. There are legislative barriers in some cases to the federal funding. In many states, the state legislature has to act, either to accept the funding or to approve big expenditures, and that takes time as well. And there are matching funds requirements for the federal funding. It used to be 5%. The more recent tranches of airdrop money have 20% matches. The EAC has kind of bent over backwards to make as much count for that match as possible, but states have to deal with that matching requirement. Also, from the report that I mentioned, we estimate that it can take 3 to 4 months simply from the signing of the appropriations bill into law to the first dollar hitting the state. So just to go back to the point, money that's appropriated in April or May of a federal election year is not getting to states until the summer or later. It's not impacting that election. All right, I want to move on to the second one because I think that my short remarks are going far too long.
Wait, that was just your first one?
Sorry. I'll be really quick. The next ones are really much easier. I want to put out there on the table an alternative way of thinking about how to do federal funding reliably and consistently, because that's the word we've heard a lot today. Certainly, right now, Congress is evenly divided, and election funding is polarized and difficult, which means that every time the Congress does agree to do state grants, you have to pass a new law for that. What if I told you that there was a huge pot of money sitting in the government that's replenishable and being mostly unused right now? And I'm up here to tell you that there is that pot of money that I think that could be repurposed to create some reliable funding for elections. If you think about elections beyond election administration and you think about campaign finance, there's something called the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. And this was the the checkoff box. It used to be $1 and $2, for a single or a joint federal return. Now it's $3.06. That was meant to provide public funding for presidential campaigns. It was very popular in the 1970s after kind of the Watergate scandal and many of the issues back then. It still exists, but no presidential candidate has accessed it for a federal general election since 2008. There's actually $412 million in that fund, and people still check the box. I still check the box on my federal tax return to send money into that fund. I think that fund can be repurposed fairly easily and become a reliable source of federal funding that can be block granted to states on a reliable method, either every odd number of years, so it's not happening in a federal election year, or even every year. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more as well. And finally, I'll talk about the trend away from outside resources. I think Congress did move, and the senators this morning talked about the ability to move during the CARES Act relatively rapidly when the pandemic hit. I think what was glossed over was the fact that the $400 million that they provided, while essential, wasn't sufficient, and that well over $400 in outside funds were also sent to Republican jurisdictions, Democratic jurisdictions to maintain the elections process in 2020. And if you talk to election officials, especially the thousands of them that received this money, if they had not gotten that funding, in many cases we would have seen meltdowns in many other places. And I think that would have been very, very, very bad for confidence in our system. I'll start by saying, first of all, that I do not think outside funding for elections is a good thing. This is a rich country, and governmental functions should be covered by the government. But taking away the capacity, which is what a lot of states have done in the past 2 years, for election officials to accept outside funding and not replacing it with more public funding is a recipe for disaster. Because even though it was very high profile in 2020, it wasn't new in 2020. It's been going on for years. And so I think there needs to be a real conversation about, if we're not going to allow election officials to get free resources from the many groups out there that try to provide resources in a bipartisan way, are we going to allow them to pay for those resources with government funds, if that's the preference for the policy? So those are the three things that I think are vital right now to talk about, because they're going to impact how elections are run in this country for a long time. And I yield back the rest of my time.
Well, thank you for that. And so now we'll jump into some questions. It was a good tee up for the first question I had wanted to ask. I mentioned in my opening remarks that each state has utilized or made plans to utilize its HAVA security funding in different ways. And so I was hoping that to start us off, Ms. Lapsley could talk about how California has spent some of that money, what the impact has been here, and then Mr. Watson, I know you hit a little bit on that in your opening remarks, but again, I think it's worth highlighting that while we often hear about the money not being spent, as Mr. Wilde alluded to, in fact, in Louisiana's case, that is all, the check's been written. So would love, Ms. Lapsley, if you could start us off and tell us a little bit how California has used that funding.
Yeah, so as Matt had mentioned, so California, as largest jurisdiction, has received the bulk of that funding across the years. And California is in a little different situation than most states, as far as being able to have the match, be able to have the resources, additional state resources to add to that. So in California, for those who don't know, we have it's a wide spectrum of counties. So on the one hand, we have Alpine County, which has 900 registered voters. And then you have LA County, which has 5.6 million registered voters, which is the largest voting jurisdiction in the country. So you take that, and that's a big spectrum. And we as a state have provided the bulk of the money, not all the money, but the bulk of the money that we've received from both HAVA and the state to the counties, because they are the ones that are administrating the elections. They're the ones that are boots on the ground. They're the ones that are putting in the work. They're the ones who have to make these changes. So the funding has the original amount obviously went to voting system replacement. It also went to statewide voter registration database. Subsequent to that, the security funds we have also used for contracts. So in California, let's go to timing. Let me just address your timing. In California, and we might be the exception, we get the money, once it's appropriated at the federal level, we then have to, get to receive it, and we also have to go to the legislature to ask for approval of it. So in California, our legislative approval process is 1.5 years out. So we need to go to the legislature and say, hey, legislature, we need authority to be able to spend this money. And the legislature has to vote on it and give us the approval for it. We then, in California, we don't just cut checks to Dean and Cami and our election officials, or Connie, used to be Connie, when that first money came out. We do reimbursement-based contracts because of accountability and requirements within HAVA and auditing. We do reimbursement-based contracts. So we go through that whole process. Then we have to do contracts with the counties before those counties can then spend the money and then ask for reimbursement back. So that's a long process. But counties have that to be able to use for certain purposes, and we have contracts in place that have identified those purposes. Touched on the first one, the election security ones were we used for election security, and we laid out provisions for that. And the requirements of those contracts were that counties did social engineering training, which is huge from a security standpoint, that they do penetration testing on a regular basis, and then there's other things that they can ask for. Unfortunately, those security funds, $5 million isn't a whole heck of a lot, as you said, in California. Penetration testing costs a lot. It doesn't matter if you're a very small alpine jurisdiction, or if you're Los Angeles County, it's going to cost a lot. And there needs to be sufficient resources to do that on a regular basis. You can't just do a penetration test once and call it good. Okay, we checked that box. And then the CARES Act funding was obviously huge. Again, the majority of that funding went to the counties for them for staffing, for PPE, for polling location requirements, and that funding was really a game changer for us as a state. Even though we did have resources, it still was a game changer for us. So that's how it's really, I think, helped our counties. And at the state level, we use a portion of it, but I think the real impact is at the county and local election official.
Thank you. And Mr. Watson, as I turn to you, actually, I think there's a nice contrast for folks who don't know about some of the diversity in the way elections are funded across the country. Louisiana, or with California here, very much many of the costs are borne out at the local level. If you could talk a little bit about how and what is funded at the state level in Louisiana, that would be helpful as well.
Sure. So Louisiana is a top-down state. So our election policies and procedures are uniform across the state. And the system we use is also uniform across the state. So unlike several states where you might have a different vendor or different type of voting machine or system in one county than the next, every parish in Louisiana has the same type of voting machine, the same vendor, everything. And currently we've got $14 million, or approximately $14 million in the Help Louisiana Vote Fund that is going to go towards a new voting system here in the future. We also have about $15 million in investments our state legislature has made in addition to self-generated revenue, and then the nearly $2 million state match that we're required to have. And it seems like deja vu all over again, because in the initial days of HAVA, we got this money to upgrade an old voting machine system after a contentious election. And here we are again about to be at the 20th anniversary of HAVA, and we see ourselves having to upgrade a system that is now considered outdated after a contentious election. So when we did that initially in the mid-2000s, we had DREs being used in 12 parishes across the state, with the rest of the state using these lever voting machines. The HAVA funds in 2005 helped us to upgrade our machines across the state to what was then considered modern technology for voting, going past the lever and punch card type of systems that were used previously. and we're looking to do that again to a paper-based system because we know that DREs are considered outdated because voters demand the confidence in their elections, and that includes having a paper backup to ensure that the vote they cast is the one that's the one that counts, so that they can actually see their vote being counted there. And we also used the initial HAVA funding to, as was said earlier, to upgrade some of our other infrastructure. Nearly $8 million worth of upgrades across the state, software and hardware that needs to be upgraded, bringing our voter registration system into the 21st century, and also going towards our ARIN system, which is the Electronic Registration and Information Network, which is created for and by Louisiana, and it's the central nervous system of our elections. That's a critical aspect of how our elections are run today, and that is in its modern form because of the initial funding we got from the earliest days of HAVA.
Thank you for that. And Matt, you mentioned in your opening remarks a little bit about this, but I don't know if you want to touch on either out of BPC's report or any of the other sort of spending you saw across the country or themes that stood out. And if not, we can skip to the next one.
Themes. I mean, it's exactly what you'd expect, right? I mean, the funding that happened in 18 and 20, not the CARES funding. The CARES funding was very specific, right? The CARES funding had to be spent very quickly within 8 months. It had to be spent in the calendar year of 2020. So it was intended to be mostly PPE and voting during a pandemic. What I'll say is the funding that I referenced earlier, the outside funding, actually allowed jurisdictions to buy some of the bigger purchases like, high-speed tabulators for the increase of mail-in ballots that was going to happen and that federal funding wasn't going to be sufficient for. But I think the themes have been very clear. You want the cyber navigators, you want to do the things that are going to help security for sure. And then there are some states that are clearly sitting on some of the money for the capital expenditures. I mean, I'll note we're in 2022, and so that first tranche of money came in 2002 or 2003 when it was finally appropriated. There are 12% of the original HAVA funds that haven't been spent yet. So states have a long history now of saving some of this money for larger capital expenditures because they don't know when the next tranche is coming.
Well, and that is a great lead into a conversation about again, this was hit in the opening remarks, but about the importance of federal funding and irregular federal funding, and how this can benefit states, and sort of, maybe we'll start on the end with Mr. Watson and just come this way. Again, the impact that federal funding stream would mean for planning, et cetera.
Well, of course, we support a consistent stream of federal funding for our elections. Again, I'll reiterate with the caveat that the federal government isn't dictating to us specific policies and procedures we have to change to get that money. They attempted to do that at one point, and that's something that we don't support because every state is different. The needs in Louisiana currently are, we need a new voting system that is more modern and that gives voters the confidence that they deserve. California's needs are going to be different than Louisiana's needs. Every state has different needs. But it would give us the consistency that we need to properly run elections. And I'll also say this, there are grants that are given to certain federal agencies, and those federal agencies will give grants to their state counterparts, and they will tell their state counterparts, you've got to give X number of dollars or a certain percentage of this money we're giving to you towards election-based spending. Well, the problem that presents itself then is we often don't see that money. There have been grants that the Department of Justice has given out, that the DHS has given out, and they go to our state counterparts, and then we don't see that money that we need to effectively secure and run our elections. And so there is currently a bill in Congress that would make the EAC the sole provider of election grant money to the states, and that's a policy we support. So yes, there needs to be consistent funding, but we also need to consider who's giving the money out, and it needs to be the EAC because they are the experts in this field. We also struggle with hurricanes in the fall every year. And the last two statewide elections, we have seen devastating and costly storms, and we have had to spend a lot of money to make sure that these elections can be successfully executed. I know we're not the only state that deals with natural disasters in the fall, so there are plenty of other states that this kind of consistent funding stream would help to ensure that even if a storm comes through the week before the election, as is what happened in Louisiana in 2020, the election can be successfully executed. And in fact, we did it in 2020 with one of the highest voter turnouts in state history.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, you positioned me in between two state election officials, so I don't know if that was on purpose or not.
It's because they can both kick you.
Exactly. So I'm going to advocate for the local election officials. I think consistent federal funding would likely make it more possible, more likely for the funding to actually get to the local level. Now, that may be happening in California, it may be happening in Louisiana, but there are many states where if you talk to local election officials, they haven't really seen much, if at all, if any, at all, of the federal funding that's happened. And if we think that some of the greatest risks are in the actual administration of elections, getting that money to the lowest level, where the boots are on the ground, I think is pretty vital. And so I think you would see local election officials using that to bolster the ranks of their actual staff, and maybe even using that money for higher poll worker pay to make sure they have enough poll workers. It's actual bodies that they need, and that can only really happen if either the states are going to put in the money or if the federal government's going to put in the money. Because I'll tell you, at the local level, when you have election officials competing with fire, schools, police, they're going to lose every time. And so the money has to come from somewhere else.
I will just interject there for those of you that don't read federal appropriations bills, which I hope is most of you. They're a treat. There has been the last few years in the House appropriation language that talks about having 50% of funding, our election security funding, be sent to the locals in cash or in kind. And I will say, I think that this panel highlights the importance of that flexibility of the language, where you have a Louisiana at the state paying poll workers in parishes. That is the top-down, bottom-up variations across the country really demand that flexibility. But certainly that is something that has been out there but not adopted.
Can I just mention one more thing? Because you mentioned the language. I also think that if there was going to be more reliable funding that was coming, there would need to be language in that federal appropriation bill about a maintenance of effort at the state level. I don't think what anyone who's talking about the federal government allocating or appropriating more federal funding, the intent is to replace the state or the counties from providing the funds. So finding a way to make sure that that's not happening, I think, is pretty vital.
I just would dovetail on what Joel said. He said every state has different needs, right? If you're top down, bottom up, whatever, we have 58 counties. I can't remember how many. 64 parishes, a state of 22 million registered voters versus for 3 million voters. The fundamental, though, is every state has needs. And the federal funding, and it has to be a whole of government. It can't just be the federal government paying for everything. It needs to be local and state and federal, will allow election administrators to plan. At the heart of every election administrator, they're planners. They used to be wedding planners, not to minimize what they did, right? They used to plan for one day and do everything that they could to make sure that day was successful and awesome. Now in California, it's more like 60 days. That event is no longer just on one day. It's 60 days and then the 30 days after for the canvass. It's a long period, and regular funding will allow them to plan accordingly and plan the right way.
Thank you. In the earlier panels, we talked about VVSG 2.0. Obviously, we're very excited that was adopted, and we're looking forward to implementation. As sneak preview, you heard a lab is soon to be hopefully certified to that standard, and we're hopeful that we'll see manufacturers bring systems into that But certainly we never saw that to VVSG 1.1. I was hoping that you all could comment about the potential for federal funding to influence the adoption of VVSG 2.0 in these new systems.
What reverse alphabetical order?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll take this one first. I'll say if you want the states and the localities to actually buy the systems, there's probably going to need to be some federal funding for that. I mean, systems don't have to get replaced that often, but this is maybe the major capital expense that election officials will have to deal with. And so certainly, when these new systems are getting certified, that's going to be great. But without some sort of sustained funding, I don't think we're going to see them anytime soon, actually in front of voters.
I mean, just for those so California doesn't, we don't use the EAC standards. We have our own standards. They meet or exceed the federal standards. We've had them since 2014. We're actually starting the process to revise, it's called California Voting System Standards. That's what we use to test and review our voting system standards. Again, for those who don't know, in California we do comprehensive testing, which includes penetration testing, red team testing, open-ended vulnerability testing, source code review, accessibility testing, usability testing, hardware testing, functional testing, and I feel like I'm missing one. I think I covered all of them. So we have those standards. Great to see the EAC getting to the 2.0 level. We ourselves are going to be moving to that next level as well, and we'll be going through the process to see what ours look like. But I think it's important that those standards are there so that it takes a while. The life cycle of them, of systems are, you guys have written those standards, but now you have to test your labs and get your labs certified. Now you have to have vendors that can bring in a system. They have to know what rules they're building to. And then they build to them, and then they bring them in, and then they buy them. So that life cycle is much longer than just having rules in place and, yeah, check the box, here's your product. So excited to see it for you guys. Looking forward to our process in California as well.
I think as it relates to our search for a new voting system in Louisiana, we have a challenge and then we also have potential. The challenge we face is the timing, because we're currently going through the process. In 2021, the legislature somewhat altered how we procure a new voting system. They created this bipartisan 13-member committee called the Louisiana Voting System Commission. That commission has completed its work and they've made their recommendation. The law then requires our office to promulgate standards for the next system, then requires us to craft the request for proposals, go out for bid, all of that. The bids come back in after they go through the current procurement code. Then another commission will then score the bids that have come in, and then they'll make a recommendation, and then we'll go forward with all the other work that needs to be done, including a pilot program and then statewide implementation of a voting system. It's a lot of complicated work. The problem we face is the timing, because there are currently no vendors that meet the 2.0 standards, and the labs aren't ready yet either, although they hopefully are coming on soon. But even if they were to come on in the next month, is there a vendor out there that can meet those standards? And is there only one? Because if there's only one, then we have a problem with accusations of bid rigging and that sort of thing. So there needs to be not just the labs coming online, but the vendors getting up to those standards. And for us, that's a challenge. However, the potential we have is that since we are going to be purchasing a system for all 64 of our parishes, for all 3 million plus of our registered voters, Secretary Ardwin has been trying to use that to pressure the vendors to say, this needs to happen sooner. You need to be moving along to make sure we're getting to those standards, because we can't just, wait around another decade to purchase a new voting system in Louisiana.
Thank you for that. And, obviously we've been talking a lot about grants, but as I mentioned in my opening, the federal government is able to provide resources other than grants. Of course, the EAC, HAVA created the EAC to be a clearinghouse of best practices in administration, and charges with the EAC with the development of a national program for testing and certification of voting equipment that we were just talking about. When you think about these, 50 state issues, 40, 45 state issues, etc. Can you talk about the potential impact such support programs can have, and particularly now in the light of the many challenges that the election community is facing? Maybe we'll start with Mr. Watson and then come down.
Well, the legislation I mentioned that's currently been introduced in the Congress would not only keep those clearinghouse functions of the EAC in place, but also add to it things like a forum for state best practices, permitting states to use unused HAVA dollars to implement voluntary considerations like post-election audits, and having the commission develop voluntary guidelines for non-voting equipment like e-poll books. And all that's great, and those are some of the things we need, especially, again, because the EAC, those are where the experts in this field are. But they're, of course, going to need more funding to do that sort of thing, to hire more experts and to get that process moving. I'll say something else as it relates to the testing and certification functions of the EAC. I think it's important to note that there needs to be better communication between federal agencies like DHS, like CISA, like the DOJ, places like that deal on some level with election issues, and the EAC itself. There needs to be a better communication there, because if there's not, then those agencies are allowing people to call into question the testing and certification that the EAC does. And that's not fair to them. That's not fair to us in the state election field, because then they're saying, well, the machines you're using, yeah, they were tested, but they didn't disclose, they didn't find this, that, and the other, and so therefore we can't trust them. And then we have to deal with that. So these agencies need to do a better job of communicating with the EAC in the future.
Thank you for that. Matt?
Well, full disclosure, I should say that I am a former EAC employee, so I do think that I've always thought the EAC is valuable and could be more valuable, but they're certainly constrained by the resources they have. I'll also say that when I was at the EAC from 2008 to 2011, we never had a conference at quite such a gorgeous venue, so I think I was there at the wrong time. I do think the EAC can have more value if it had more resources, for sure, right? One is research. We want policy to be developed based on evidence, and it's hard, but it's frustrating, I would think, because at their core, I mean, elections are full of data. I mean, they're nothing but data. But for the most part, that data isn't used to make good policy. How and where are Americans voting? Are they moving away from a traditional polling place? Can there be benefits to moving to more of a vote center model? How to do that wisely? That evidence needs to be clear, and I think you want somebody collecting it from a national perspective and providing that data out for the public to think about. And I think that what EAC has done with the election management guidelines and the quick start guides is great, and it could be far better. The election officials at the local level, well, we're seeing certainly a very high rate of turnover right now, but I do think that that's not uncommon. There's always a lot of turnover in this field, and so you have a lot of election officials who are new, who their next election is going to be their first election, and certainly having some baseline guides to get them up to speed on all, or at least many of the things that are consistent across states would be very helpful. So those are two things that I think are beyond the technology for sure, the coordination for sure, that EAC could do a lot more of if it could maintain a higher level of resources.
Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, I think that what both Joel and Matt hit on are absolutely correct. I think I would just add to that the quick start guides are great. They can be a lot better for those states that don't have the resources to generate those kind of things. Those are great tools, templates for them to follow, to be able to plagiarize those and use those to get information out to voters. Because when you start talking about elections, it's tough a lot of times. There's a lot of details that go into it, and election administrators sometimes get stuck in the weeds, and being able to explain all the different pieces is really tough. So I think if the EAC can really find plain language to provide for states to use, I think that can be a huge tool. Training, I know that Election Center has done training for many years, but I think the EAC can take a leading role in that, to be able to train election officials, whether new or old. I learn every day. on election administration, on emergent technologies, all those things that we have in the election sphere to be able to train those officials in a forum where it's good training, it's comprehensive training, and it's clear training.
Thank you for that. I've got one more, but if anybody's got cards, we can go ahead and pick those up. And so my last question, this is also going to be a preview for the final panel of the afternoon, but the final panel is the future of elections, and so I wanted to have my last question be about the future of election funding. And I'll note that the election infrastructure sector-specific plan, which is part of the outgrowth of the critical infrastructure designation, starts out, there's a funding section. It says, it's impossible to make an honest assessment of the election infrastructure subsector's risk and the potential to mitigate that risk without an understanding of the chronic resource issues the subsector faces at all levels of government. Recognizing that and thinking about funding, we've hit on some of this, but what are some of those key considerations for election funding as we move forward to the future? Susan, we'll start with you and go down.
So I would hope that the future of HAVA funding is, I hate to beat the dead horse, but that it's consistent and it's substantial enough to allow election administrators to do their job and to do it effectively. And I think there does need to be some flexibility built into it for emergencies. So right now, for those of you who haven't been to this area, and I'm going to mispronounce this, the Castaic fire that is burning, and they're having evacuations. That's the reality of election officials. You guys had the storm. You can't postpone election day. You can't postpone the election. Not even the pandemic postponed the election, other than West Virginia. The show must go on, and there needs to be funding to allow those jurisdictions that are impacted by natural disasters to potentially use the HAVA funding to be able to administer their elections in the face of wildfire that's burning down the homes and people are having to evacuate and go someplace else. So that would be my hope for the future for funding.
Matt?
Yeah, I think my hope is that it gets out of this cycle of we only fund in a substantial way after a crisis or after something melts down. It's not a really good way to do this. If I could wave a wand, I'd like my idea, which is to repurpose the Presidential Election Campaign Fund to find a mandatory source of funding, because election funding is likely going to stay a political question for a long time, and leaving it in the discretionary budget is difficult. And again, you talk to any election official, they're talking about consistency. You really can't get that without completely changing how election funding has happened over the past 20 years at the federal level. So I think we need to talk about, and I'm not saying that's the only idea, but I think that there are ways of doing this that have to be explored and currently aren't really being talked about in a real way at the federal level.
I was counting how many of the past few years we've had a statewide election, and there could have been more before this, but I know that at least since 2014 we've had a statewide election every single year in Louisiana. Senate, governor, presidential, special elections, that sort of thing. Every single year since 2014 through to 2024, we will have had a statewide election. So a consistent stream of federal dollars would be a huge asset to us. It would be a huge asset because we are constantly in need of finding ways to ensure that we can pull off these elections in the midst of great catastrophe. That would be a huge help to us. And it would be a huge help. I'd like to reiterate what these two have said earlier. Federal legislation, when it comes to funding, needs to tell the states, we're going to give you this money, and we're going to give you this money to do as you see best for your state to fit the needs of your state. But this doesn't mean you get to stop making a contribution towards those efforts. That legislation needs to make that clear, because states cannot just decide, well, the federal government's coming in and giving us all this money, we're going to stop contributing. And I know that in Louisiana, we've had $15 million put towards our next voting system by the legislature and through some self-generated revenue. They also passed a bill this year that will raise the pay of our election commissioners. Hopefully that will help us recruit I know every state's going through that problem of recruiting election day commissioners, early voting commissioners, that sort of thing. That's a problem we're facing too. Hopefully this will help us. So they have made some investment. Hopefully there's more to come, and hopefully the federal government will step up and give us that consistent stream that we need.
Thank you for that. We got some good questions here. I think I'm going to combine a couple of them. Matt, I'm going to start with you. We'll go Matt, Joel, Susan. Let me check time here. Susan, you might get the final word here, the home state advantage. So we've hit on this a little bit, but just to combine a couple thoughts here, or if there's anything that we missed, specifically the ideal timeline for federal election funding, and then any changes to the HAVA grant structure that would improve the impact of the grants to local jurisdictions. And so, Matt, we'll let you start with that.
Yeah, I think the funding timeline, there's no ideal. I think it's mostly expectations based. What I was saying earlier was the federal Congress, has expectations for funding that are completely unrealistic. 18 money isn't going to be spent in 18. 22 money isn't going to be spent this year for the most part. So that's one issue. BPC has long been on the record as you don't make major changes to your either policies, your laws, or your infrastructure in a federal election year. Now, certainly when you have statewide elections every year, it's always going to be complicated. But you certainly want to roll out new technology and new laws with enough time for voters to get used to it before your highest turnout elections. So all these things have to be taken into account when you're thinking back. I don't know that necessarily changes or impacts when the money is being delivered, as long as the expectations understand those limitations, or what I think should be limitations on when states are making changes to their process with the money.
I'll briefly interject that in 2018, as a Rules Committee staffer, I knew that the 18 money wasn't for 18, but then they gave me a different job, so I can't swear to what's happening right now. Joel?
I'll agree that it's not necessarily the timeline, but it's the matter of having that consistent funding so that we can expect. We know that when we're going into an election year, we'll have the help that we need coming from our federal partners. As far as on the local level, because we're such a different state as far as how we run elections at the statewide level, top-down state, versus all 64 parishes doing different things, I can't really speak as much to that. But I'll say that if they were to put in language in legislation that says you have to give this amount of money or this percentage of these funds to local election officials, well, that would affect us, because there are certain things that we're going to pay for at the state level that the parishes and the clerks of court and the registrars of voters in those parishes are not necessarily going to be paying for, that the counties may pay for in other states. So that's why, because that's just one way we're different than the other 49 states at how we run elections, and that's why election funding needs to have flexibility in it so that we can do what's best for us.
Parishes. Think about it. Again, for anyone that's spent any time around elections, if you assume that there's something that's right for all 50 states, you are assuming incorrectly. And so that is always at the heart of anything that relates to 50 state elections, is that it depends. And so as promised, Susan, I will give you the final word here. Again, home state, you get to take us out on a high note.
Oh my goodness. I actually don't have anything to add to what they said. I agree with them 110%. Pete, I do have to say that Declan gets an A in whatever class he has because he knew what a butterfly ballot was. But thanks for having us. This was a great conversation. I appreciate everyone's attention and contribution to it. So thank you very much.
Well, big thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you so much for being here and your contributions. And we will get ready for the final panel of the day. Thank you all.